There we go. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Maria. All right, let's pull up the PowerPoint one more time. Okay, thanks again. So my name is Abby Jones. Welcome. I am the Vice President of Legal and Policy at Penn Future, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. Our presenters today, we have Jessica O'Neill. She is a senior attorney at Penn Future based out of Philadelphia, where her work focuses on protection of Pennsylvania's public natural resources, including clean air and water. Jessica leads Penn Future's litigation team on matters impacting communities and the environment, including watershed protection, fighting against expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, and ensuring the rights of Pennsylvanians under the Environmental Rights Amendment of the Pennsylvania Constitution. Tim Hayes is the policy analyst for Conservation Voters of PA. Tim supports CVPA's policy and legislative advocacy and is passionate about advocating for social equity and sustainability opportunities for people across the Commonwealth. And serving as the Lehigh Valley Field Coordinator for both Penn Future and CVPA, Maria Ocasio is responsible for identifying, engaging, and mobilizing a strong base within the community to bring about change and awareness on environmental issues. In recruiting, training, and managing volunteers, Maria is working to bring about a more energy efficient and sustainable Lehigh Valley. And before we get into the update, I just want to take a moment to remind everybody what RGGI is and how it works. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, is a cooperative effort among 11 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states to cap and reduce the power sector carbon dioxide emissions. So PA's carbon budget and trade rule, known as the RGGI rule, is the Department of Environmental Protection's program that was published as a final rule in April of 2022. And this would set up how PA participates in the RGGI exchange. This followed years of engagement, including immense support from the public, like many of you, so thank you, after Governor Tom Wolf announced his executive order back in October of 2019, which set this all in motion. Participating in RGGI would make Pennsylvania the first major fossil fuel producing state to put a price on carbon. Under RGGI, power plants must pay for each ton of carbon dioxide they emit. Each participating state sets up its own regulation and decides how much carbon pollution they will allow from electric power plants, otherwise known as a cap. For each ton of carbon allowed under that cap, the states create an allowance. These are terms of art, so that's why I'm using the air quotes, and establish participation in regional RGGI carbon allowance auctions. So operators of large electric generators like coal or fracked gas power plants must obtain an allowance for each ton of carbon they emit, most of which will likely be purchased at quarterly RGGI auctions. Each state will then get a share of the auction proceeds commensurate with their auction allowances, and states can choose how they want to invest that money. But only if it were that simple, right? So let's turn it over now to Penn Future Senior Attorney and the lead counsel for the environmental interveners in the RGGI litigation, Jessica O'Neill.
Hi, everyone. As Abby said, I'm Jessica O'Neill. I've been representing Citizens for Pennsylvania's Future and our litigation partners, who are other environmental groups, other nonprofits who have been participating in this litigation about the RGGI rule. So I'm just going to try to give you an update. The legal proceedings have been very confusing for everyone, lawyers and non-lawyers alike. But I'm going to try to give you an update as to where we are and what issues remain before the courts, because they are significant. So Abby, if you could flip to the next slide, please. There are two main groups challenging the RGGI regulation. As Abby just went through, the Department of Environmental Protection enacted the RGGI regulation in 2022. It was published in that year, and there are two groups of entities challenging it. The first is a group of individual legislators. They are legislators who don't want Pennsylvania to participate in RGGI, and they are politically opposed to it, and so they filed claims before the Commonwealth Court challenging the regulation. So that's one of the cases. The other group are industry and labor groups affiliated with the fossil fuel industry who also challenged the regulation. That case is called the BOFIN case, if you've seen references to that, the first named coal entity. who challenged the rule is called Bofin. So that's the second case. We've been in this litigation for 2 years now, so we have a little bit of a better grasp on what the opponents to RGGI are saying. But basically, at this point in all of these cases, they really have one argument against RGGI that remains. RGGI, as Abby explained, imposes a requirement that electricity generating units who are covered by the regulation purchase allowances for each ton of carbon dioxide that they're going to emit. When the Department of Environmental Protection enacted this regulation to have us join RGGI, they referred to this as a fee. And the department is, under the Air Pollution Control Act, which is like Pennsylvania's Clean Air Act, authorized to collect fees in exchange for pollution that's permitted under the regulation. The challengers to the rule claim that this fee, this amount, is so large, it will bring in so much revenue that it's really more like a tax, that it's not really a fee, that it's more like a tax. And they argue, under the Pennsylvania Constitution, only the legislature can enact a tax. So their legal argument is RGGI is not a fee, it's an unconstitutional tax. That's the argument that they made before the Commonwealth Court. They had other arguments along the way, but this is really the argument that remains, that RGGI is in effect an unconstitutional tax, and therefore only the legislature could pass it, could enact it into law, because it's a tax which only the legislature can do. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So on November 1st of this past year, November 1st, 2023, the Commonwealth Court agreed with those challengers. The Commonwealth Court, which is the first, sort of like the trial level court here, the first court to hear this challenge, agreed with the challengers and found that the RGGI rule was unconstitutional and agreed that it was in effect an unconstitutional tax. On November 21st, the administration, the Governor Shapiro administration, appealed those decisions to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Shortly thereafter, the environmental group Citizens for Pennsylvania's Future and our litigation partners, which include Clean Air Council, Environmental Defense Fund, and the Sierra Club, also appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now, you might be saying, wait, didn't we do this already? Weren't we back in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court last May? Don't I recall a lot of emails about that? And the answer to that question is yes, we have been to the Supreme Court on these issues already, because as you might remember, the groups challenging the rule, the people engaging in the litigation, asked for a preliminary injunction from the Commonwealth Court last year, which basically says, hey, court, this is going to be really complicated, and we think that you need to stop this rule from going into effect while you consider all the rest of these legal arguments. The Commonwealth Court last year entered that injunction, and that's what we all challenged in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court this past May. We were hoping that the Supreme Court would rule on that before the Commonwealth Court decided the rest of the case, but they didn't. So now the Commonwealth Court's opinion, finding the rule to be unconstitutional, is really the most important thing that's going on in the case right now. And so we've appealed that decision to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court again. Now, I know that there's some questions of why did the environmental groups appeal if the Shapiro administration had already appealed? We are absolutely gratified that the Shapiro administration appealed, because we still think that RGGI is constitutional and is a good idea for Pennsylvania. We also appealed because we are attempting to bring in additional arguments into this case, specifically about the Environmental Rights Amendment. As Pennsylvanians, we all have rights in our public natural resources as beneficiaries of our Article 1, Section 27 constitutional rights under the Environmental Rights Amendment. And we think that that's really important to be before the Supreme Court as they consider this rule. So that's a piece that we are bringing into this case. And so we separately filed our appeals to the PA Supreme Court also. We could go to the next slide. So bottom line, what this means is that RGGI is not in effect right now. The rule is not in effect. The court has said it cannot go into effect, and it can't go into effect unless and until the Pennsylvania Supreme Court finds that it is constitutional. So now that we've got these new appeals pending before the PA Supreme Court, they will take these appeals. They will, at some point, enter a briefing schedule, and at some point, we'll have argument on these on this issue, this tax versus fee issue. I am hopeful that this will all happen by the end of 2024, but I have to say that is a bit of a prediction. It could take less time. It could take more time. There's no real timeline set up by the court for how long it can take to decide a case like this. If the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturns the Commonwealth Court, then the Department of Environmental Protection can implement the RGGI regulation. If they affirm the Commonwealth Court, then DEP can't implement the regulation as it's written right now, and we'd have to do something different. I think it's important to remember that because, in part, because of the nature of these arguments, that it's about whether it's an unconstitutional tax or a fee, the legislature always has the ability to enact RGGI as a matter of law. They've not done that, which is in part why we have this regulation the way that it is. But we need the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to overturn the Commonwealth Court and issue a ruling that it is constitutional for RGGI as it stands right now to go into effect in Pennsylvania. And I think that is the end of my section, and I will flip it back to Abby.
Great, thanks, Jessica. I think that was an amazing and quick summary, very thorough. I don't know how you did it so quickly. So thank you, and thank you for all of your effort in leading the charge to support and defend RGGI over the past year plus. And we'll have questions and answers at the end, so continue to put those in the chat. And then we'll turn it over to Tim now to give a legislative update. So Tim, take it away.
All right, thank you. All right, so my name is Tim Hayes, and I'm a policy analyst for Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, and we are a strategic partner with Penn Future. And we're really glad that Governor Shapiro's administration has taken the necessary steps to appeal the Commonwealth Court's RGGI decision, and we're really looking forward to working with the state legislature to ensure that RGGI auction proceeds are effectively and equitably enacted. So there are two aspects of RGGI that I want to touch on very briefly. The first thing I want to discuss is the opposition. Now, I'm sure you've all heard that the common myth that RGGI will drive up the utility bills of Pennsylvania ratepayers, and I'm here to say that this could not be further from the truth. Other states that are currently participating in RGGI have already used their proceeds towards energy efficiency programs, which in turn help reduce electricity bills. So for $1 of auction revenue in RGGI states, $4 of consumer energy bill savings have been created on average. And from 2018 to 2020, participating states gained nearly $670 million in economic benefits. In Pennsylvania, ratepayer assistance programs funded through the sale of carbon allowances would mean an annual savings of about $24 in the average household. So when you hear legislators say that implementing RGGI will raise energy costs, just remember that not only will RGGI reduce costs and spur economic development, those very same legislators often vote to give out billions of dollars in taxpayer money for fossil fuel subsidies. And the second aspect of RGGI that I want to touch on is the legislative actions that would be needed to implement the program. When the state Supreme Court hopefully allows the Department of Environmental Protection to enforce the program, Pennsylvania won't necessarily need legislation for DEP to enforce air pollution standards, but it will be incredibly helpful for several reasons. So DEP will be enforcing RGGI via the Air Pollution Control Act, which allows them to regulate carbon pollution from power plants, but it limits the ways that DEP can spend proceeds generated from RGGI's allowance auctions. The Air Pollution Control Act mandates that all RGGI proceeds be deposited into Pennsylvania's Clean Air Fund, which DEP could then use to combat air pollution. But having legislation in place can ensure proceeds are utilized for other environmental programs throughout the Commonwealth. And thankfully, there is a piece of legislation that currently has a co-sponsor memo called the RGGI Investment Act, which will be introduced in the state Senate by Senator Carolyn Comita. And it would be the reintroduction of a bill from last session when it was Senate Bill 15, that's SB 15. So, for example, corresponding legislation like the RGGI Investment Act can ensure investments are being made in environmental justice communities who often bear the brunt of legacy pollution from oil, gas, and coal-fired power plants, or proceeds can be used to help shuttered coal communities recreate their economies through workforce development, infrastructure upgrades, and public service funding. And if the legislature fails to act on implementing legislation targeted to those communities, they could miss out on millions of dollars in RGGI proceeds. And as such, it's critical that the legislature have legislation in place in anticipation of the state Supreme Court's ruling so that we can hit the ground running to help these communities get the funding that they need. However, there are anti-environmental legislators in Harrisburg that have repeatedly cast doubt on RGGI and have either blocked pro-RGGI legislation or have tried to pass legislation that restricts Pennsylvania's participation in the program. Former Governor Tom Wolf had to veto anti-Reggie legislation several times, but now that pro-environment legislators control the state house, it's very unlikely that any anti-Reggie legislation makes its way to Governor Shapiro's desk. So the most important thing we can do is to encourage state leadership in the House and Senate to take up pro-Reggie legislation as soon as it's introduced. So this way we can combat air pollution while also investing in our communities that need it the most. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks all for listening. I'll pass it back to Abby.
Tim, wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all the work that you're doing in supporting this. And those numbers are shocking. And we really do need to get Reggie through so we can start reaping some of those benefits here in Pennsylvania. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Maria to talk about our Reggie Defenders. Thank you all to all of you on this call who are Reggie Defenders. It's incredibly important that the public supports this. We couldn't do it without you. So, Maria?
Hello, everyone. Well, listen, I have had the absolute distinct pleasure, myself and other field coordinators wave on the screen. I've been able to oversee more than about 110 Reggie Defenders. And what is a Reggie Defender, you may ask? Well, this is our mighty group of volunteers who've assisted in rapid response actions. And those rapid response actions could be making phone calls or sending text messages, urging constituents to contact their legislators to support Reggie. That could also mean anything, from submitting letters to the editor to help with public education and attending Reggie events much like this. So as Abby said, if you are a Reggie Defender, I do want you to raise your hand or do a little wave because yes, we need to thank you because it is because of your work we have been able to do some tremendous things and hold folks accountable. So just a little sneak peek of what you all did. We've made thousands of calls, which led to over hundreds of constituents contacting their legislators. So just an example, in one of the harshest times when legislators were pushing anti-Reggie legislation, you generated over 300 calls to 10 key swing voter districts. You folks also submitted 30 letters to the editors, 17 of which were published. And again, because of your work, we wouldn't be able to do this without you. And I want to keep this in mind. While this is certainly an amazing start, and I am beyond grateful for what you did, we do, as you're hearing, we absolutely do need to keep this energy up and we need to continue to push for Reggie. So, of course, we need your support. And so I'm asking you, if you're with us today and you want to join the Reggie Defenders, just let us know here in the chat, or you can send me an email. Both my emails will be placed in the chat box. You can, again, reach out if you haven't already. And again, we'll make sure that you're added to our list that gets the first information, this first sneak peek as to what's going on with Reggie and how you can help us. So I really appreciate it, folks, and I will turn it back to Abby.
Maria, thank you so much. It's really important that we get the support. And so I'm going to take a moment to do a shameless plug. I want to thank each and every one of you for not only joining us today, but for your support of Reggie and helping our organizations in fighting for a cleaner environment, for healthier communities, and for fighting back against the climate crisis that impacts us all. And if you want to further support Penn Future's legal efforts to support and defend Reggie and our constitutional environmental rights, please consider becoming a Penn Future member today. Your support makes it possible for our attorneys to do what we do best. Just visit pennfuture.org and click on the donate button. So that brings us to the end of our very quick Reggie update. We'll now move into the questions and answer section. I want to thank everybody who pre-submitted questions through our form, and we'll get to those. And I have been trying to track everybody's questions in the chat. If for some reason we don't get to it, just continue to put it in there and we'll make sure that we flag it for you. And when we do this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other and really feel like we're having a conversation here. Okay. So our first question, and Jessica, this one's for you. I think it's a little bit of a wonky one, but what are the legal definitions of tax versus fee, if you can talk to that? Like, are there numerical ranges by definition, or how are those really distinguished?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really the legal issue that's at the heart of this case. So, as with most legal questions, there's not sort of a yes, no, less than 100, over 100, black and white kind of answer for that. But there is a lot of law. And there is a lot of law in Pennsylvania about how you decide if something is a tax or is a fee. And there's some cases with some great names that you'll see cited all over the parties brief. My personal favorite is called National Biscuit. I just think that that's great. And the parties talk a lot about what makes something a tax versus a fee. And really in Pennsylvania, you have to look at not just the amount, but what it is going to do. A tax is designed for the hallmark purpose of raising revenue. Governments tax in order to raise revenue for their general coffers, to be able to do stuff that tax dollars go to do trash collection and build roads and fund schools and all the things that the sort of general purposes that tax dollars go to. Whereas a fee is designed to run a particular program and to do a particular thing. And one of the things that we and the Department of Environmental Protection have argued here is that one of the reasons that you can know that this is a fee is that the money doesn't go to the general revenue, doesn't go to the Pennsylvania Treasury, doesn't go to just sort of our general PA bank account. It goes to a specific fund that the department manages called the Clean Air Fund, which is specified by the statute, by the Air Pollution Control Act, to be used for the elimination of air pollution. And then the statute, the Air Pollution Control Act, sets out a number of specific things under that the fee has to go to. So one of the things that we in the department have argued is that you have to look at all of these different pieces and put them together, and just sort of at base, the money doesn't go to the Treasury, right? It's not for the general purposes of raising revenue. So even if it's a large amount because the elimination of air pollution is a large program, it's a large project. It's not going to the general Treasury as general revenue. But there's a lot of arguments here, and the parties argued them before the Commonwealth Court. We argued them before the Supreme Court in connection with the preliminary injunction, and we'll argue them again now before the Supreme Court in the appeal of the main decision. But I think as a matter of law, it is quite clear, and I am confident that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court will agree that it's more properly viewed as a fee rather than as a tax.
Thanks, Jessica. And then I know it's all about tea leaves here, but what do you think the chances of success with the PA Supreme Court are?
I hate to sort of make a prediction. I believe, but here we're helped a little bit because we did listen to their questions and we did argue before them back in May on the preliminary injunction. I think that they are very engaged in this issue. I think that the PA Supreme Court wants to make good law here. I think that they were really paying attention to the issues. I think that they were very interested in the issues that our groups brought before them on the Environmental Rights Amendment, and this idea that the protection of public natural resources and the rights guaranteed to the beneficiaries are really important. And also under the Environmental Rights Amendment, when you are using up a resource, the monies that you get in connection with that resource have to go back to maintain the resource. I think there's a lot of things at play here. So I am very hopeful that the PA Supreme Court will agree with Penn Future and our partners and with the Commonwealth, and we'll find that RGGI is constitutional. We're a little ways from getting there, but I am hopeful that that will be the ultimate outcome.
Thank you. And I just want to recognize that we've only scheduled this for 30 minutes. We are going to stay around if you all can stick with us and try to get to all the questions. This is also recorded and we'll send it around in case you do have to leave at 12:30. Again, thank you for these amazing questions. We have a bunch of them that are similar, and we are making them through it, so don't worry. I will get to them all, hopefully. I think there's two questions that I do want to get to, but we seem to be leading towards this one. So can maybe Tim, maybe Jessica, can you speak to the possibilities and efforts of getting RGGI passed by the legislature? Like, we know that Governor Wolf did this through executive action or executive order. We think that's appropriate, but If for some reason the Reggie rule does get overturned by the PA Supreme Court, what do we do then?
Right. Yeah. So I kind of spoke on that earlier. The Republican caucus in the state House and the state Senate has voted in lockstep with each other against implementing any aspect of Reggie, both in the last session and in this session as well. So since the Democrats control the House, but the Republicans control the Senate, it's kind of hit a bit of a roadblock right now. Of course, that could change in the coming years as the composition of both chambers change. But as it currently stands, the Republican caucus has voted in lockstep against it, and they haven't made any sort of notice saying that they will vote any other way. So that's kind of the biggest roadblock that we've been having right now, which is why the Supreme Court proceedings are so important, because that will definitely help Pennsylvania get the ball rolling with it a little bit. And we're confident that if and when the state Supreme Court's vote in their favor, the Reggie Investment Act can be used to use these proceeds to invest in communities that these legislators who may be voting against it, they can still take advantage of that funding for their districts. We kind of saw the same thing with the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed a few years back, where a lot of the legislators who were voted against it are now touting the investments in their districts. So we're kind of thinking that it will kind of take on the same form. I think there is some skepticism, but I think we're pretty optimistic that once the same state Supreme Court votes in our favor and Pennsylvania will be entering it and the proceeds will be generated, I think some legislators will kind of have a change of tone to utilize that Reggie Investment Act in their districts. So yeah, it's kind of all up in the air right now, but that's kind of I think the general timeline for it.
Great, thanks, Tim. And this is more of just like a clarifying question, but and Jessica, you may have talked to this, but say that the Supreme Court upholds Reggie, the Reggie rule. Is there anything else that needs to happen before the rule can go into?
There's certainly some administrative things that the Department of Environmental Protection will have to do, but the rule has been published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. The department, my understanding is, was gearing up to participate, to have to be ready to implement it. There is some lead time built into the regulation, right? So if the Pennsylvania Supreme Court rules on January 1, which they won't do, but just to make an easy date, if they rule on January 1, it's not as if covered entities would have to be ready to purchase allowances on January 2. Instead, what they'd need to do is be tracking their carbon dioxide emissions, which they're already doing, and being prepared to have the correct allowances for, I believe it's half their sources by a certain time period, within a certain number of months of the effective date of the rule, and then the rest of their allowances within a certain number of months from the effective date of the rule. So there's some process built into it. And the way that the sort of overall Reggie structure works is that auctions are held quarterly. So there are multiple opportunities for entities to acquire the allowances that they need in order to assure compliance with the rule. Reggie's not new. Pennsylvania's attempt to participate in it is new, but the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has been around for 15 years. And states have been participating in it for 15 years. So there's been a lot of time for some of these issues for the market to be developed, and for entities that have compliance obligations to figure out how to do that. And they've been tracking their carbon dioxide emissions for, a not insignificant amount of time also. So there is some lead time built into it. It's not an overnight process, but I do think that it would be speedy in terms of the ability of covered entities to start meeting their obligations.
And we're just going to continue down this line. I know, because I think it's flowing very well. So another question that's popped up is, I think we've heard Governor Shapiro say, there might be other ways, but just to confirm, there's no other option than to Reggie on the table. Is that correct?
There's certainly not at the moment. The legislature has not, proposed a bill that would be something akin to but different from Reggie. I know there's been discussion of RGGI is already a region, right? There are 11 other states that participate in it. Of course, our power grid has sort of a overlapping but not entirely matching region. Our power comes from the PJM power grid, which includes states that are part of RGGI and states that are not. But PJM doesn't, it's not a government. It doesn't have the authority to create some sort of PJM-wide RGGI program because they're not a state, they're not a regional government. They're a power grid. So we don't at the moment have an alternative to that anybody that's developed or serious or in effect or anything like that.
And then another just clarifying question. So if RGGI is upheld by the Supreme Court, could a future governor withdraw PA from RGGI?
Well, that's sort of the situation that we've seen in Virginia, where Virginia became a participating RGGI state. They had a change in administration, and the new governor wants to withdraw the state from participation in RGGI. In Virginia, that's subject to litigation, so it's not that hasn't happened yet. I think what's important to remember there is that once a regulatory agency enacts a rule, a subsequent administration can undo it, but they have to go through the regulatory process that they did to make the rule. So a new governor can't just say, I withdraw us from RGGI after the prior administration went through the whole multi-year process of creating a regulation. There'd have to be a regulation to undo it. So that certainly could happen. But again, as we've seen in Virginia, it's not an overnight process. And if we do enter into RGGI, you can be assured that organizations like ours will seek to keep us in RGGI and would fight against any attempt to withdraw us from a program that we know works and reduces air pollution.
Another legal question on the tax versus fee issue. Has the unconstitutional tax argument been used in other states or in other cases? And if so, were they successful?
So it's been percolating on the edge of some other challenges. It's not entirely new, but here in Pennsylvania, it is sort of a question of Pennsylvania constitutional law. And in other states where the legislature enacted legislation for the state to participate in RGGI, that wasn't really an issue. So we're seeing that more in PA because of the way in which our Commonwealth operates. And it is a question here of Pennsylvania state law.
Thank you. And then somebody had asked if the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, has intervened in any of the RGGI cases.
They have not intervened, and I don't believe that they have filed any sort of supporting or friend of the court, which we sometimes call amicus briefing also. I actually don't know if the PUC has taken a public position on RGGI.
Thank you. Going over to Tim or maybe Maria, how can I find out if my state reps support RGGI?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways you could do that. If you go to conservationpa.org, we release a scorecard for every legislative session that tells you how exactly each state representative and each state senator votes, and it lists a certain list of bills that are either anti-environment or pro-environment. So you'll be able to see how exactly they voted on any pieces of legislation pertaining to RGGI in the past few years. Another great way is, reaching out to their offices directly. You can call state legislator's office at any time during the 9 to 5 hours, and you can ask for, the representatives or the state senator's position on it. They can give an explanation. You could write to them via email. Of course, Maria can speak on this a little bit more, but we do have an ACE program that we do manage every now and then with certain state legislators, where we help constituents connect with state legislators in virtual or in-person settings. So there are a lot of different ways, but I'll let Maria speak to that a little bit more.
Absolutely. And Tim, thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for dropping the links. And we have that scorecard that gives you a quick snapshot But folks, absolutely, during our ACE meeting, our Advocates for Conservation and the Environment, we bring up such topics as this. So we meet with our legislators and we do hold them accountable in the politest way, of course, as possible. I know some of you folks have already been ACE members with us too, but this is a topic that comes up, and this is something that we review, and we do, get honest feedback from our legislators with where they're at with that.
Great, thank you. And we're going to keep going, folks. So if you can stay with us, great. If not, again, we will have this recorded and we'll send that out. And Maria, this kind of goes to what you were just talking about, but and all the great Reggie Defender and ACE meeting work that you've been doing, but how do we get the message of Reggie and its value for climate change and public health out to the general public, out to our neighbors and our family members and of course our elected officials?
Absolutely. Well, folks, that is a lofty goal. So we have many tools in which we do that. So the one effective tool is you're all here right now, you're living proof. We have these educational webinars to kind of break down some more cumbersome or complicated topics like this. We have letter to the editor campaigns where not only do we provide talking points, but it's a real-time tool to hold our elected officials accountable, but again, it provides that public education that we're looking for. We have one-on-ones in which we can talk to our volunteer about a plethora of different topics. And again, we have those ACE meetings where we do hold our officials accountable. And prior to that, I provide a one-on-one training or not one-on-one, a group training, and where we delve a little bit deeper into, okay, what does this mean and what we'd like to say. So those are some of the tools that we use to publicly educate folks. And also, this is where I like to empower people, where it's the most impactful. Listen, you folks right here are some powerful education teachers to those who are closest to you. Never underestimate the power of relationship and that relational organizing. So if it's coming from me, if you already know me, that might carry some weight, but coming from you to a friend or a family member, that's going to carry a bit more. Same thing with your legislator. You folks are constituents. You have the power to vote them in or out. So coming from me, that's one thing, but coming from you, that's where the power comes in. So relational organizing is absolutely key as well.
That's wonderful. And we also had a pre-submitted question from an actual amicus supporter in one of the Commonwealth Court cases from a group of scientists, including some colleagues from Villanova, asking, what, if anything else, can they do or can folks do to support the litigation at this point?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we're at the point where we're not seeking folks to testify, in court, and we're not gearing up for a trial or anything like that. What's going to happen next is another appellate proceeding before the Supreme Court. So that'll mean submitting briefs to the justices and then at some point having oral arguments. So it was great to have those scientists submit their brief to the Commonwealth Court and to the PA Supreme Court on the appeal the last time. If there are, folks who are connected with a legal bent or who want to do that again, of course, that's always an option. I do think that the other forms of advocacy, as Maria and Tim talked about, contacting your representatives, engaging in that kind of advocacy is so important right now. We did have a phase of these proceedings, of course, at which we were presenting testimony to the Commonwealth Court. And I know that there are some of our members and supporters on this webinar who did testify before the Commonwealth Court back in May of 2022. And, we're so appreciative. And it's so important when regular folks, regular people, regular Pennsylvanians who are impacted by these regulatory enactments do come forth and speak their experiences to courts, to justices, to decision makers. So everybody who's on this chat who participated back with us over the past 2 years, thank you so much for that. And I do think it's at this point now where it's sort of the lawyers are doing their part and submitting their briefing, and the advocacy fronts really are the places that Maria and Tim talked about.
And Jessica, just to piggyback off that a little bit, folks, you want to create as much high visibility as possible so that it's not forgotten. There's a ton of pieces of legislation, I'm sure you're aware, it goes across folks' desks, and it's very easy to forget, especially during the holidays, that, oh man, this is important, this is happening. We have to keep that energy going. So please, if you are interested in writing that letter to the editor, if you are interested in talking to your legislator, really hope you do sign up, because it's easy for them to forget if there's no energy or no fire behind it.
Okay, I think we're just about wrapping up our questions. If you have any final questions, throw them in. This one's going to take us a little bit farther away from Reggie directly, but and this might be a question more geared towards Tim. Do you think there's any chance of getting the legislature to act to increase solar and other renewable energy goals if Reggie remains in limbo? Right? We know the Commonwealth Court's going to, the Supreme Court's going to decide one way or the other, but how does that impact in any way our renewable energy goals and our support for things like solar?
Yeah, so there are a couple different avenues that Pennsylvania is expanding its renewable energy portfolio. At the state level, there are a couple different bills that are making their way through the House and Senate that are going to expand like solar and wind production. There's House Bill 1032, which is the Solar for Schools program that's currently in the Senate right now. There's House Bill 1467, I believe, the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act, which will increase Pennsylvania's renewable energy portfolio to 30% by 2030. And there are a lot of different bills in the state right now that are kind of trying to do that without Reggie's auction proceeds. Of course, if we did have those proceeds in place, it would be a huge help, and I think that would help get those bills across the finish line to the governor's desk a lot easier. But another aspect of that is the federal funding that is at risk if we don't implement Reggie. So I didn't have a chance to talk on this sooner, but with the increased deployment of solar, wind, and battery storage systems due to Pennsylvania's participation in Reggie would actually bring in about another $900 million of additional Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, which is the sweeping climate bill that President Biden passed last year. So if Pennsylvania were to implement Reggie, Pennsylvania would actually benefit from about $2.2 billion worth of IRA tax credits from the construction of in-state renewable energy, which would help meet our decarbonization goals and would also spur manufacturing, especially in manufacturing and coal communities that have otherwise been shuttered due to economic uncertainty. So there are a lot of different state and federal aspects of it that are kind of at risk if we don't implement Reggie. And state legislators are doing their best to kind of work their way around that, but of course a state itself can only do so much. So if those Reggie proceeds were in place, it would mean hundreds of millions of dollars in additional tax credits from federal funding, but also make state bills get across the finish line a lot easier because there's not that worry of we won't be able to afford it.
Thanks, Tim. And Jessica, Tim, I don't know if you know this, but do you know how much money has been left on the table by not enacting Reggie over the past year plus?
Well, what you really want to look at there are the auctions that Pennsylvania did not participate in. So I don't have that number at my fingertips. I know that we've published a number of blogs on this. So if you wanted to look at some of the blogs on our website, our climate guru Rob Altenberg has written a couple of blogs about this. But as I said, the auction is held quarterly, and covered entities can purchase allowances at that auction. And so we would want to look at all of the auctions that have been held since the department attempted to enter Reggie in April, of 2022. So it's all the auctions that we've held since then. And I did see a question in the chat a couple of times, and so I do want to respond to the question about in-state versus out-of-state production of electricity, because I do think it's important that the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection can regulate sources in Pennsylvania. This is not an attempt by DEP to regulate sources outside of Pennsylvania. They can't do that. But what they do is they regulate sources within Pennsylvania. And that's significant because we produce a lot of power in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of air pollution gains, a lot of reductions in air pollution to be gained by regulating electricity production in PA, which is the same way that other states who participate in the RGGI program do. They regulate sources of production within their state borders. Each state, as Abby explained, sets its cap, right? Sets its amount, and then the states within RGGI, then there's then it's an initiative across the state. So, if we look at the rule, the impact on air quality in PA is significant just from our Pennsylvania production.
Thanks. I have 3 more questions. So again, thank you for sticking with us as we continue through these. So I'll just get right into it. And this has come up a few times, so I want to make sure that I kind of capture all of the questions that get to this. But basically, what are some of the ways that this money can be used, assuming that we get into the RGGI auction? And like, how is that directed or dictated what that goes to?
I'm going to take the first part of this, and then I'm going to turn it to Tim to talk about the pending legislation. But any proceeds collected from the RGGI auctions would go within the Department of Environmental Protection to the Clean Air Fund. And the Clean Air Fund is created by statute by the Air Pollution Control Act to receive fines, fees, and penalties that the department receives as part of the air pollution control program. The statute sets out a number of things that the Clean Air Fund can be used for the elimination of air pollution. It would have to implement a program. It can do all these other things. So right now there is sort of within the Air Pollution Control Act and the implementing regulations, a system for what those funds would be used for. But there's also a lot of legislative activity to spell out more specifically how the RGGI fund specifically, not just any old fines, fees, and penalties, but these specific RGGI proceeds would be used. And so I'm going to flip over to Tim to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. So, like I said earlier, the pending legislation right now that'll kind of be used as the driver for these RGGI proceeds is the RGGI Investment Act, which in the last session was Senate Bill 15, and it divided the proceeds up into 3 sections. So, like Jessica said, 46% of the proceeds would have gone to the DEP's Clean Air Funds. That would have been the main driver for it. 37.5% of RGGI proceeds would go to a new Energy Communities Trust Fund, and then that would be used for, like I said earlier, workforce development in shuttered energy communities, infrastructure upgrades, like public service funding, like for police, firefighting, EMS, schools, whatever is needed. And then the last 12.5% of the proceeds would go to a new Environmental Justice Communities Trust Fund. And that would be used for investments in environmental justice communities. And all of this will be in accordance with the federal government's Justice 40 initiative, which it kind of requires that any federal funding that is used, 40% would go towards environmental justice communities. So it's kind of using the same guideline for state funding. That was the bill as it was written in the last session. I'm not personally, it hasn't been released yet, so I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be those exact percentages, but that was the form that the RGGI Investment Act took on in the last session. And we're pretty confident it'll be fairly similar. So that's kind of the composition of it right now. It would go to the Clean Air Fund, and then the new Energy Communities Trust Fund, and the Environmental Justice Community Trust Fund, which would be managed by the Department of the Treasury.
And then I know that there's been another question, but I'm going to wrap it up with one final question, which we're going to end on a happy note. Just kidding, folks. Is there a plan B if RGGI is not enacted? I know we've covered this a little bit, but I think this is a good thing to discuss as we close out. So I'll open it up to everybody. If Jessica, Tim, Maria, if you want to weigh in on that.
We have not seen a plan B from any wing of government at this point. I certainly believe that we need to reduce our carbon dioxide pollution as well as our the rest of our local air pollutants that come from power plants. So at Penn Future, we have every interest if RGGI is not enacted in helping to create / promote / defend a Plan B. We don't have one right now. And we are still in this litigation process where we're waiting to see if the PA Supreme Court says we have to have a Plan B, or if we can go with Plan A, which was RGGI. So, I think the next few months will give us a little more information about whether we need a Plan B and how to make that, how to do that.
Yeah, and I'll also add, some of you may have seen in the news recently that the Governor Shapiro did convene a RGGI working group to it was a mixture of, environmental groups and industry leaders, labor groups to kind of come together to see the viability of RGGI in Pennsylvania. You may be shocked to hear that their findings were inconclusive. They couldn't agree. They agreed that Pennsylvania needs a carbon reduction program of some kind, but they stopped just short of saying that RGGI is like the program. And of course, there's a lot of different reasons for that. Industry and labor groups, like Jessica said, have their concerns with it. So yeah, as it currently stands, there is no solid Plan B in place. So it's really just up to the legal proceedings as of right now.
Okay, great. I see that there are continuing questions come in, and we're going to cut it off at this point. I'm sorry for those folks, but we will be sharing this recording and our contact information with everybody. If you want to follow up with us, please do. Our information is on the websites too. And I want to thank you all for engaging in this discussion. Thank you genuinely and sincerely for all of your support over the years. We're really looking forward to all our new RGGI defenders who have provided their information. This is very exciting. And for hopefully the new supporters of our legal work. Penn Future membership is incredibly important to continue to support the things that we do. I want to give a shout out to Emma Bast, who was on this call with us. She's the other attorney working on the RGGI litigation. I want to say thank you to Lauren and Anna at CVPA for supporting us on the back end of this presentation. We couldn't have done this so seamlessly without you. And of course, I want to thank Tim, Maria, and Jessica for an amazing and informative discussion. Thank you all and have a good Tuesday.